Hello, I'm Sami Zaidan. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics. This week, 2018, the year in review. The good, the bad and the ugly of 2018, starting with a trade war between the largest economies on the planet. Plus, Qatar became the first Middle East country to leave OPEC and Saudi Arabia became a riskier country to do business with. Talking tech, it was the year social media faced a backlash, but 3D printing got a boost. And last but not least, paying for climate change. It was a huge question as 2018 drew to a close. Find out why that matters. Trade disputes, Brexit, renewed US sanctions on Iran, and the gruesome murder of a Saudi journalist. Political and economic risk was highly visible in 2018. The International Monetary Fund and World Bank are warning trade tensions are threatening to rip apart the global economy. Soaring debt is also threatening to spoil the party. In April, the IMF warned it came in at $164 trillion, a historic peak. It's advising governments to prepare buffers to protect themselves. There may be more danger ahead, even if the world economy is projected to grow by 3.7% this year and next. Gregor Irwin from Global Counsel has more on the global economic outlook.
I think the really big concern is China. Now, China, growth prospects remain good in China. Nobody's expecting a major slowdown tomorrow in Chinese growth, but the big concern about China is that debt to GDP is still rising. It's projected to rise further still. It's very high by the standards of other countries or by historical standards, and frankly, it looks unsustainable. So I think that is a genuine concern over the next few years for the stability of the global economy. We're not in a trade war yet, but there is a risk of a trade war. One of the concerns about a trade war is that it wouldn't just involve the US and China. It would inevitably drag in other countries as well, and other countries would be caught up in the crossfire, if you like, between the US and China. Right now, I think it would be fair to describe US policy as unpredictable, also quite aggressive. Equally, I think when you look at China's policy stance, also what the Europeans might do, if there are any measures, significant measures introduced targeting China or others, I think we can expect to see retaliation, and that's where the trade war scenario really begins to potentially become a real one.
On the upside, the world's largest and second largest economies recently agreed to postpone new trade tariffs for 3 months from January the 1st. But the pause doesn't mean the war is over. The US and China's differing opinions over intellectual property protection need to be ironed out. Greg Swenson, founding partner of London-based Brigg Macadam, explained the trade dispute isn't going away anytime soon unless both sides make concessions.
I don't think the goal has been demonstrated or the goal has been articulated well by the president. What he seems to dwell on is the trade deficit, and he picks these arbitrary numbers or targets for trade deficit reduction, which I think is a mistake. What he should focus on is that China is violating all kinds of free market and open market policies and rules. You know, they've taken them to the WTO 16 times in the last couple of years, and they've won all 16 times. But that doesn't seem to be fixing the major problems, which are, you know, theft of IP and you know, the complete disregard for free market principles. So, look, I wish that there was a better way, and perhaps there is. He's picked this one, and I think that he's somewhat lost the narrative or lost the messaging battle, because it looks like the U.S. is provoking a trade war when, in fact, what he's trying to do is fix something that needs to be fixed. I don't think these tariffs will stay in place because they're self-defeating. It's not really going to hurt the American consumer or the American economy. You know, in many ways, the president's playing with the House's money. The economy is kicking on all cylinders.
2018 marked a decade since the global financial crisis hit. Since then, greater regulation has been introduced. But 10 years later, it's young people who seem to be picking up the bill. Russell Jones, a partner at Llewellyn Consulting and former employee of Lehman Brothers, spoke to us about the legacy.
I think there have to be some really innovative responses to this. I mean, income inequality, wealth inequality are huge issues. And as you hinted, there is increasingly an intergenerational element to this, with the young feeling that they're getting very much the thin end of the wedge, as it were. I think politicians are going to have to be agile, innovative. My sense is that the way to look at this is that we need to become more interventionist. That doesn't mean that we have to abandon the sort of capitalist model which has, notwithstanding the crises we experience, has been so successful for so many centuries. But in order to make that capitalist model work and work well, we're going to have to redistribute more, and we're going to have to think of some new ways of doing that. My sense is that higher taxation on the wealthy is unavoidable. My sense is that more transfers from pensioners back into the younger generations is unavoidable. We are going to have to do this. Otherwise, the political environment we face, which is already, let's face it, pretty fraught, is going to become even more unpleasant and even more difficult to deal with. I would say that addressing income inequality is something which will help to save the current system rather than undermine it.
Well, after the end of the last global financial crisis, record low interest rates in the US meant many developing nations borrowed in dollars. Well, that came back to haunt them this year. You see, the dollar has strengthened, and it's now costing those countries a lot more to repay their debts. And for economists, it's raising alarm bells. We spoke to Timothy Ash, Senior Emerging Market Sovereign Strategist with London-based Blue Bay Asset Management.
Well, it means more pressure. I mean, we enter the year in a Goldilocks scenario for emerging markets, or it appeared that way, with DM central banks tightening but moderately, but the assumption was that global growth would stay pretty robust, and as long as global growth stayed fine, then on the revenue side, emerging market countries will be more than able to cope with higher DM and US rates. I think what's changed in terms of perceptions has been the dollar rally. That's one thing. That obviously increases debt service costs in hard currency, in dollars, for many emerging markets. And I think the other one has been concern about trade wars and what that means for global growth.
Argentina was one of those countries that made a cry for financial help. Its currency, the peso, lost half its value against the dollar this year. The country already has some of the highest interest rates in the world and is now on financial life support. Well, during 2018, it secured a $57 billion loan from the IMF, the largest ever loan in the fund's history.
Because Argentina was frozen out of the markets for so long, its weighting is still relatively low, and therefore the impact is more going to be on investors locally, but also foreign direct investors. The chances of a default near term are low because they do have good relations with the IMF. But I think what needs to happen for the time being is that there needs to be a greater burden sharing. It had, up to now, mostly been on foreign investors and local taxpayers. It needs to be more on the corporate sector, which had been receiving a lot of subsidies, particularly, for example, to invest in energy and electricity, where there hadn't been any investment for 10 or 12 years, but also the foreign direct investors who are going to have to bear some of the additional losses.
Now, the murder of Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi at his country's consulate in Istanbul shocked millions. We asked how much power Saudi Arabia really wields over the global economy. Chris Garcia used to work for the US Department of Commerce under President Trump and is the chief executive of Vicker Financial. He gave us his perspective on the importance of the kingdom's oil to the rest of the world.
It's actually quite important, certainly particularly in the short run. This is why when we look at some of the potential retaliation tactics that the Saudis have threatened, we have to take them seriously. The Saudis have significant assets. They hold probably the third most natural resources, with about $35 trillion worth of natural resources within their territory. And if the Saudis do make good on this retaliation threat, of potentially raising oil prices by cutting output of oil production, raising oil prices up to $400 per barrel from $80 per barrel, which is about more than double just about the all-time high of the 2008 all-time high of $150 per barrel. That would have significant reverberations throughout the global economy. U.S. shale exports and the shale industry has taken off. We have seen a boom here in the U.S., and we're now on pace to beat Saudi Arabia and surpass Saudi Arabia by Citibank's estimates next year as an overall leader in both crude and overall oil product exports. But however, in the short run, that's what we have to be most worried about. It's the short run repercussions of the Saudis cutting output that would send shockwaves throughout the global economy. But I would say that that's leverage, it would diminish in the long run unless they diversify as the world continues to diversify itself from its energy resources.
Still to come on Counting the Cost, tales from the crypto, why digital currencies like Bitcoin and Ripple were out of favor in 2018. Back in November, Iran was effectively shut out from the dollar-dominated financial system when the Trump administration decided to reimpose sanctions. The measures are aimed right at the heart of the Islamic Republic's economy, oil. 8 countries received a 6-month waiver, but this still puts enormous pressure on Tehran. We spoke to Sara Vakhshuri, president of SVB Energy International, who explained what's next for Iran and oil prices.
There is an expectation in the market that in the next 6 months, by mid-2019, the market is going to face oversupply due to the higher export capacity from U.S. and also lower demand. So the market would be more ready at that time if further pressures on Iran is needed. All of these 8 countries that are importing oil from Iran, none of them are going to give any types of currency back to Iran, and Iran can only import humanitarian goods or necessary goods, those goods that are not subject to sanctions, back to Iran. So they're kind of bartering their oil for food or medicine or necessary goods. Now we have European Union that they are coming up with specific channels of trade with Iran, banking transaction with Iran, and if these channels are built for more formal and more usable ways of working with Iran, this of course is going to weakenize dollar as a weapon. Also, Iran is now selling its oil in a local currency to these 8 countries. So I agree. I mean, if we push this more, or if we want to use this as a weapon, it's going to, and it is losing its influence. But we cannot also deny the fact that this all have its own consequences on Iran's economy.
Qatar became the first country in the Middle East to quit OPEC in 2018. Its decision to move away from the cartel and focus on its natural gas exports comes at a time when questions are being raised about who's really setting global oil policy. There's a feeling that Saudi Arabia, along with non-OPEC countries like Russia and the USA, are calling the shots.
It's very difficult to understand the rationale for countries to be either in or not in the organization. Of course, you can say there is a certain concentration of power with the bigger players. They have something to say and their decisions have a huge impact. But of course, at the same time, if you look on the smaller members producing maybe 200,000 barrels a day, 400 or more, those volumes don't really matter so much when it comes to the end of the day. It's always nice if more countries are part of it, but why do they contribute? Well, OPEC is a research organization, so having access to that research is maybe interesting for those countries, but also, I would guess, having an international platform where the politicians can be seen to communicate and to be on the same level with politicians of other countries. The production cut is necessary because there's quite a lot of surplus right now. And it's not necessarily just because of the Iranian story and the consequences, but it is because a lot of supply is emerging from many other countries. And on top of that, the biggest supply addition this year, of course, is the US.
We've also reported this year on countries trying to diversify their economies away from oil and plan for a different kind of future. And young people and women are demanding a more inclusive role in that society. One of the advisors to governments in the Middle East is the International Monetary Fund. Christine Lagarde, the managing director of the IMF, was in Doha earlier this year. In an exclusive interview, Counting the Cost asked her about the role of women in the region and the changing economic headwinds.
Well, because I care about this region of the world and because I visit very often, my first advice would not be to the young women, it would be to the leaders of those countries. And my advice would be, first of all, look at your legal structure, your legal arsenal. Are the laws providing equality for men and women? Second, I would say, look at your budget. Are you providing for parental leave? Are you providing for childcare centers? Are you helping the woman access or stay on the job market? So that would be my first call to the leaders, because policies can actually change the map. And I would also say to them and to people, if I can reach out to them, change your mindset. Consider how valuable women can be for your economy, how much additional growth they can provide, how much more sustainable that growth will be, how more resilient it will be, and how much inequality you're going to eliminate. Then I would turn to the women, my sisters, and I would encourage them to, number one, get as much education as they can. And I hope that this is accessible in the country where I talk to them, not always the case. I would second say, have enough self-esteem, take confidence in what other women in the area or beyond can achieve, and just be yourself and make sure that you have a voice. And if you can't find your voice, get the support of other men and women who will be supporting you along the way.
Millions in the UK are worried about what the new year will bring. That's because the government has yet to reach a consensus on how to exit the European Union at the end of March. Well, the UK's economy is slowing and the currency has weakened as politicians continue to argue, and many voters are beginning to ask if Brexit is an expensive miscalculation. Peter Dixon from Commerzbank has more.
I think when you look back 2-3 years ago, those people who pushed for Brexit, I don't think expected to win, and they clearly never had a plan to deliver in the event that they did. So now we've wasted an awful lot of time and effort since the referendum trying to figure out how to deliver a Brexit which it's not even clear that the electorate now wants. So it has indeed been very expensive, both in terms of absorbing government time and the energy which businesses now have to spend in order to prepare for something which, frankly, may not even yet happen. GDP is about 2 percentage points below where it would otherwise have been in the absence of Brexit, and that can be calculated in a number of ways. I mean, that's a bit like saying we've almost lost a year's growth over a 2-year period, which is quite a considerable sum. So without putting a precise figure on it, I think it's fair to say the number's big. Well, I think on the current projections, on the assumption that we don't get a hard Brexit, growth will continue to remain in the area of 1.5%, give or take a little bit. Obviously, at the start of the year, if we get continued uncertainty, then that could lead to maybe a bit more weakness in investment growth. Consumption would, of course, be impacted by the strength of inflation, if there is indeed any, as a result of the weakening pound. So at the start of the year, I rather suspect we'll get off to a slow start, but on the assumption that some of this Brexit uncertainty is eliminated or smoothed away, then over the course of the year, I rather hope, and I think the consensus expects too, that growth next year will be similar to what we've seen this year.
More people in 2018 have access to the internet than safe drinking water, and the world's digital population keeps growing. There are fears the world is not reaping the so-called digital dividends of this transformation. More than 2 billion people actively use Facebook on a monthly basis, which has had a decisive year. Alistair Reid, the principal researcher and policy director at the European Future Innovation Systems Centre, has more.
In terms of Facebook, I think it's been particularly hard hit by some of the concerns that have arisen over the different scandals that have taken place in terms of the access to data and the use of that data, particularly related to elections. And I think that's had an effect. I think also that's a sort of natural trend in any market. People, particularly I would say the younger generations, are looking for other tools and moving to other areas, other apps and platforms. So there is a sort of a natural trend, I think, linked to the sort of hit that they've taken from the sort of privacy abuses that took place related to Brexit and other referendums and elections more in the last year or so. I think this has had certainly a negative effect. Is it the peak of Facebook? Well, I'm not sure if that's yet the case. I think they have a very strong position. But I think it's a very good example of where there's a need for clear regulation and checks on that, the use of the data that's collected by such a company.
Staying with digital, what a difference a year makes. This time 12 months ago, Bitcoin mania was all around. But the crypto hype hasn't been matching the reality lately. Bitcoin is down around 75% from its all-time high of nearly $20,000, depending on what exchange you're looking at. Garrick Hillman has more on the drivers behind the situation.
We've seen prices of crypto assets like Bitcoin go up and down in the 10 years that they've been in existence. Bitcoin just celebrated its 10-year anniversary. It's a new asset class. It's uncertain how we should value it, and the type of volatility we're seeing is not a surprise. However, I think there's a growing acceptance and acknowledgement by not just technologists, but also regulators that blockchain technology and cryptocurrency are very much part of the future architecture of our financial system. There certainly has been some work done by academics and others looking at trades on certain exchanges that do look suspicious. I think there is a big question mark around that. There's questions around how much trading volume is real and how much of it is spoofed or is wash trading. I think there's a general consensus that there has been some monkey business basically at work at some exchanges at least. And that's all part of the maturing of the space and something that needs to get cleaned up for institutional investors and retail investors to feel more confident and comfortable owning crypto assets.
2018 saw the world's first habitable 3D printed houses, the newest technology causing a stir in the construction industry. Known in the trade as additive manufacturing, some say it could change how we live and construct homes in the future. Simon Hart from Innovate UK explained how it works.
Well, actually, the technology is actually relatively mature in smaller scale. So small-scale 3D printers have been available even for domestic use for many years. Now, what you're doing with a large-scale 3D printer is really extending the scale and the size of that 3D printer. But there's a fundamental difference, is that domestic 3D printers will typically use plastic. They will heat up the plastic till it becomes a liquid and then print that liquid in a line. They wait for it to cool and then print the next layer. Now, with houses, if you're using a concrete, for example, you have to wait for that to set or to become solid before you go to the next layer. So whilst the similarities are there with domestic 3D printing, it's actually a lot more complex to do this with structural materials such as required to build a house.
Who exactly will have to pay for saving the planet is a big question these days. A UN body published their answers in 2018 following 3 years of research. We can limit global warming and prevent a climate catastrophe if radical change is made. Now, we're here in the Middle East, an area that is petro-dependent, and trying to find ways to diversify away from fossil fuels and create jobs for people who live here. So we asked Michael Grubb, Professor of Energy and Climate Change at University College in London, what a carbon-free future looks like for this region.
The Middle East obviously has a concern that much of the Middle East is dependent upon oil, not so much on coal, and coal is the first in the line of fire. It's a sort of the biggest sinner in terms of climate change, if you like. But one issue for many in the Middle East is what does the future look like if we do have to curtail oil demand? That's probably going to affect some other regions like oil shales first, because they're actually a bit more expensive and a bit more carbon intensive. But still, we're talking about, rather than the past century largely fueled on expansion of coal and oil, this century being about their contraction and the rise of solar, wind, other renewable sources. So that's the first thing. One needs to think, what's the energy economy of countries, in this case Doha, Middle East, countries traditionally heavy dependence upon oil, significant on gas, though that's kind of both good and bad. It's much cleaner than coal. Britain, we've halved emissions in the power sector, partly by using gas instead of coal.
And that's our show for this week, but remember you can get in touch with us via Twitter. Use the hashtag AJCTC when you do, or drop us an email. countingthecost@aljazeera.net is our address. There's more for you online at aljazeera.com/CTC. That'll take you straight to our page, which has individual reports, links, and entire episodes for you to catch up on. That's it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Sami Zaidan from the whole team here. Thanks for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.